February 14, 1943, 7 elite Army Corps engineers set out on what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission in the remote wilderness of northern Alaska. They were tasked with surveying potential sites for a military installation that could change the course of World War II. They never returned. For 80 years, their disappearance remained one of the military's most classified mysteries. No bodies, no equipment, no trace. That is, until a construction crew working on a pipeline expansion in 2023 made a discovery so shocking that it would reopen the case and reveal a truth buried deeper than anyone could have imagined. The jackhammer struck something that shouldn't have been there. 3 feet below the permafrost, construction foreman Mike Garrett watched his crew uncover what looked like military equipment. Rusted, corroded, but unmistakably from another era. As they carefully excavated the site, more items emerged: survey equipment, radio gear, personal effects, all bearing the insignia of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But these weren't just any engineers. The serial numbers matched equipment that had been reported missing 80 years ago, along with 7 men who vanished without a trace during one of the most critical periods of American military history. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison stared at the classified file that had been locked away since 1943. The words Operation Polar Star were stamped across the cover in faded red ink. Inside, mission reports, personnel records, and a mystery that had haunted military investigators for 8 decades. 7 of the Army's most experienced engineers, specialists in Arctic construction and reconnaissance, had been dispatched to a region so remote it didn't appear on most maps. Their objective was classified then, and it remained classified now. But the discovery of their equipment 80 years later would force the military to confront questions they thought were buried forever. The mission began on February 10, 1943, at Fort Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. The United States was deep into World War II, and the military was desperately seeking strategic advantages. The Aleutian Islands had already been attacked by Japanese forces, proving that America's northern frontier was vulnerable. Military planners needed to establish a network of bases and installations across Alaska's vast wilderness, but first, they needed to know where to build them. Sergeant First Class Robert Chen was the mission leader, a 32-year-old engineer from San Francisco who had already completed 3 Arctic surveys. His team included Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a demolitions expert from Texas, Corporal David Kim, a communications specialist, and 4 other engineers, each chosen for their specific expertise in cold weather operations. They were the best of the best, men who had survived brutal training exercises in conditions that would kill ordinary soldiers. The official mission briefing was sparse. Survey grid coordinates 67.2 north, 149.8 west. Establish potential sites for strategic installations. Duration, 7 days maximum. Radio check-in every 12 hours. The location was approximately 200 miles north of Fairbanks in a region of Alaska that was largely unexplored and unmapped. Indigenous tribes spoke of the area in whispers, calling it the place where the earth sleeps. But the military wasn't concerned with local folklore. They needed strategic positioning, and this remote valley offered natural protection and proximity to key transportation routes. What the briefing didn't mention were the strange reports that had been filtering in from the region for months. Pilots flying over the area reported unusual magnetic readings that interfered with their instruments. Sled dog teams refused to travel through certain sections of the valley. Most troubling were the accounts from a geological survey team that had worked in the area the previous summer. They described finding excavations that appeared to be man-made but predated any known human activity in the region. The geologist's final report contained a handwritten note in the margin that simply read, "Recommend avoiding grid section 7G, unstable conditions." The 7 engineers departed Fort Richardson at 0600 hours on February 10th, traveling by military transport to a forward staging area 50 miles from their destination. From there, they would proceed on foot and by dog sled, carrying specialized equipment for Arctic surveying, including theodolites, drilling equipment, radio gear, and enough supplies for 10 days in temperatures that regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The first radio check-in came at 1800 hours that evening. Sergeant Chen's voice was clear and professional. "Base, this is Polar Star Team. Grid position Alpha 2. Weather conditions nominal. Proceeding to primary objective. Next check-in 0600 tomorrow." The transmission was logged and filed. Everything appeared routine. But the 0600 check-in never came. Initially, this wasn't cause for alarm. Radio equipment was notoriously unreliable in Arctic conditions, and teams often went silent for hours due to atmospheric interference or equipment failure. But when 24 hours passed without contact, Fort Richardson began to worry. By February 14th, 4 days without communication, a search and rescue operation was authorized. The rescue team faced conditions that would challenge even the most experienced Arctic specialists. A massive storm system had moved through the region, bringing with it blizzard conditions and temperatures that plummeted to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was near zero, and the wind chill made exposed skin freeze in minutes. But these men were trained for exactly this type of emergency. If the Polar Star Team was injured or stranded, every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Search teams approached the mission area from 3 different directions, using dog sleds and tracked vehicles designed for Arctic operations. They followed the planned route that Sergeant Chen's team should have taken, looking for any sign of the missing engineers. What they found defied explanation. The team's initial campsite was located exactly where it should have been, but it appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Equipment was scattered, partially buried by snow, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. More puzzling were the tracks. The search team found evidence that the engineers had indeed moved deeper into the valley, but their trail simply ended. Not gradually, not obscured by weather, but ended abruptly, as if the 7 men had simply vanished into thin air. Experienced trackers examined the site for hours, but there was no logical explanation. The footprints, clearly visible in protected areas where snow hadn't drifted, led to a rocky outcropping, and then disappeared completely. Over the next 2 weeks, the search expanded to cover over 500 square miles. Aircraft flew grid patterns when weather permitted, and ground teams scoured every valley, ridge, and potential shelter. They found pieces of equipment scattered across a wide area. A compass here, a section of rope there, items that clearly belonged to the missing engineers but offered no clues about what had happened to the men themselves. The most disturbing discovery came on February 28th, 2 weeks after the engineers had vanished. A search team exploring a narrow canyon found Sergeant Chen's personal journal partially buried under a rock slide. The final entry was dated February 12th, just 2 days into the mission. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, completely unlike Chen's normally precise script. The entry read, "Ground conditions unstable. Equipment readings inconsistent with geological surveys. Recommend immediate extraction. Something is wrong here. The Earth itself feels wrong." Below that, in different ink as if written later, were 3 words that chilled the search team to their bones. "They are watching." The search was officially called off on March 15, 1943. 7 experienced soldiers, men trained to survive in the harshest conditions on Earth, had vanished without a trace. The official report classified their disappearance as presumed dead due to extreme weather conditions and difficult terrain. Their families were notified, death certificates were issued, and the case was sealed under military classification. But questions lingered. How could 7 men simply disappear, Why was their equipment scattered across such a wide area? What did Sergeant Chen mean when he wrote that the Earth felt wrong? And who, if anyone, was watching? The answers would remain buried for 80 years, locked away in classified files and forgotten by all but a few military historians who occasionally wondered about the fate of the Polar Star team. The remote valley in northern Alaska returned to its silence, visited only by caribou and the occasional bush pilot who reported strange magnetic anomalies that made their instruments spin wildly. But the Earth keeps its secrets only so long. And in 2023, when construction equipment broke through the permafrost and uncovered equipment that had been missing for 8 decades, those secrets would finally begin to surface. What the construction crew found wasn't just military equipment. It was evidence of something far more extraordinary, something that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about that remote corner of Alaska and the 7 men who disappeared there in the winter of 1943. The pipeline construction had been routine until that moment. The crew was working on schedule, cutting through frozen ground to lay new sections of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. But when Mike Garrett's excavator hit something solid at 3 feet deep, everything changed. What emerged from the permafrost wasn't rock or frozen earth. It was metal, corroded and ancient, but unmistakably manufactured. As word spread through the construction site, work ground to a halt. The crew gathered around the growing pile of artifacts being carefully extracted from the frozen ground. A theodolite, its brass fittings green with age. Radio equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. Personal items wrapped in what remained of military-issue canvas. And stamped on every piece of equipment were serial numbers and markings that would soon send shockwaves through military archives in Washington. Dr. Sarah Mitchell received the call at her office at the University of Alaska's Archaeology Department. The voice on the other end belonged to a construction supervisor who sounded equal parts excited and nervous. "Military artifacts," he said. "Old ones. Really old ones. Could she come take a look?" Mitchell had spent 15 years studying Alaska's military history, but she wasn't prepared for what awaited her at the construction site. The items were laid out on tarps, organized by type and condition. Mitchell's trained eye immediately recognized equipment from the 1940s, but the pristine condition was impossible. Metal that had been buried in permafrost for decades should have been destroyed by corrosion and freeze-thaw cycles. Instead, these items appeared to have been preserved in a state of suspended animation. But it was the serial numbers that made Mitchell's hands tremble as she photographed each piece. She recognized the format, the military designation codes that were specific to Army Corps of Engineers units from World War II. Within hours, she was on the phone with contacts at the National Archives, requesting access to equipment manifests from 1943. The match was undeniable. Serial number 7794-CE belonged to a surveying theodolite assigned to the Polar Star Reconnaissance Mission. Radio equipment bearing designation 442-COM had been checked out to Sergeant First Class Robert Chen on February 9, 1943. Every piece of equipment found at the construction site corresponded to items that had been reported missing, along with 7 soldiers who never returned from their mission. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the equipment ended up buried 3 feet underground in a location that was more than 50 miles from where the engineers had last been seen? The construction site was in a valley that hadn't appeared on any of the original mission maps. There were no records of the Polar Star team ever operating in this area. More disturbing was the condition of the burial site itself. The equipment hadn't been scattered randomly or buried by natural processes. It had been carefully placed, almost ceremonially arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate human intervention. Tools were nested together, personal items grouped separately, and the entire cache was wrapped in military canvas that should have disintegrated decades ago but remained remarkably intact. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at the site 2 days later, accompanied by a team of military historians and forensic specialists. The discovery had triggered protocols that hadn't been used since the Cold War. When military personnel go missing, especially under classified circumstances, their cases never truly close. They just wait. Harrison studied the excavation site with the eye of someone who had spent 30 years investigating military mysteries. The positioning of the equipment bothered him. This wasn't the result of soldiers dropping gear while fleeing or dying. Someone had taken the time to organize these items, to preserve them, and to bury them in a location where they might never be found. The forensic team began expanding the excavation, using ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface area around the initial find. What they discovered defied conventional archaeology. The buried cache extended much further than initially thought, forming an almost perfect circle roughly 30 feet in diameter. But more intriguing were the anomalous readings at the center of the circle, where the radar detected what appeared to be a void space beneath the permafrost. As they dug deeper, following the radar signatures, the excavation team encountered something unprecedented. 4 feet below the equipment cache, their tools struck what appeared to be worked stone, not the rough granite and schist common to the region, but smooth, precisely cut blocks that fit together with mathematical precision. The stones bore tool marks that didn't match any known construction techniques from the 1940s or earlier. Dr. Mitchell found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about Alaska's history. Carbon dating of organic material found between the stone blocks suggested construction that predated any known human settlement in the region by thousands of years. Yet the military equipment from 1943 had been carefully placed directly above this ancient structure, as if someone had known exactly what lay beneath the ground. The construction crew, initially excited by their discovery, began reporting strange experiences as the excavation continued. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason. Compasses spun wildly, pointing in different directions within seconds. Several workers complained of feeling watched, of seeing movement in their peripheral vision that disappeared when they turned to look directly. Mike Garrett, the foreman who had made the initial discovery, found himself unable to sleep. Every night he dreamed of 7 figures in military uniforms standing at the edge of the excavation site, watching silently as his crew dug deeper into the permafrost. The dreams were so vivid that he began arriving at work early each morning, half expecting to find footprints in the snow around the dig site. The military investigation team worked around the clock, cataloging every piece of equipment and comparing it against historical records. But for every answer they found, new questions emerged. Personal items belonging to the missing engineers were present, but they showed signs of use that extended far beyond the 7-day mission timeline. A wristwatch belonging to Corporal Kim had been wound recently, its mechanism still functional despite 8 decades in the ground. Most puzzling was Sergeant Chen's field notebook, found wrapped in oiled canvas at the bottom of the equipment cache. The first half contained standard mission notes, weather observations, and technical drawings that matched the team's known objectives. But the final entries, written in Chen's distinctive handwriting, described discoveries that weren't mentioned in any official reports. Chen wrote about finding structures beneath the permafrost, carved chambers that seemed to extend deep underground. He described symbols etched into stone walls, patterns that repeated throughout the underground complex. Most unsettling were his observations about the other members of his team, notes suggesting that something was affecting their behavior, making them act in ways that weren't natural. The final entry in Chen's notebook was dated February 18th, 6 days after the team's last radio contact. But according to official records, the search teams had found no trace of the engineers by that date. How could Chen have been writing in his notebook nearly a week after his team had supposedly vanished? The entry read, "The others don't understand what we found here. They think we can just leave, report back to command, and continue with the war. But this place, these structures, they're not finished with us yet. Torres keeps talking about going home, but I don't think we're going home. I don't think we ever were. As the excavation expanded, the team began uncovering evidence of a much larger complex beneath the permafrost. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of chambers and passages that extended in all directions from the central burial site. The construction was sophisticated, featuring drainage systems and ventilation shafts that suggested the builders had intended the complex to be occupied for extended periods. But who were the builders? The stonework predated any known civilization in Alaska by millennia, yet it showed signs of recent habitation. Modern materials were found mixed with ancient construction, as if someone had been maintaining and updating the complex well into the 20th century. The military team established a secure perimeter around the excavation site, classifying the entire operation under national security protocols. Word of the discovery was spreading through archaeological and military circles, generating theories that ranged from plausible to fantastic. Some suggested the complex was a forgotten military installation from World War II. Others proposed more exotic explanations involving everything from lost civilizations to extraterrestrial contact. Harrison knew that whatever they had found here was going to reshape understanding of the Polar Star mission and possibly Alaska's entire military history. But as his team prepared to descend into the chambers below, he couldn't shake the feeling that some mysteries were meant to stay buried. The 7 engineers who had disappeared in 1943 had found something extraordinary in this remote valley. Their equipment, carefully preserved and deliberately buried, was just the beginning. The real discovery lay beneath the permafrost, waiting in chambers that hadn't seen sunlight for thousands of years, but showed clear evidence of recent occupation. Whatever had happened to the Polar Star team, whatever they had discovered in those underground chambers, had been significant enough to warrant the most extreme measures to keep it hidden. But now, 80 years later, the secret was emerging from its frozen grave. The first team to descend into the underground complex consisted of Harrison, Dr. Mitchell, and 2 military specialists equipped with advanced lighting and communication equipment. The entrance shaft had been carved through solid granite with precision that defied explanation. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and featured geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the artificial light. 20 feet below ground level, the shaft opened into a circular chamber roughly 40 feet in diameter. The team's flashlights revealed stonework that belonged in an ancient temple, not buried beneath the Alaskan wilderness. Massive blocks fitted together without mortar, their surfaces covered in symbols that resembled no known written language, but scattered throughout the chamber were unmistakably modern items, military rations from the 1940s, still sealed in their original packaging, a field radio, its battery compartment corroded, but the unit itself remarkably preserved. Dr. Mitchell ran her fingers along the carved symbols, her archaeological training struggling to process what she was seeing. The stonework showed techniques that shouldn't have existed in this region for thousands of years. Yet the craftsmanship was flawless, displaying a level of engineering sophistication that rivaled modern construction. More puzzling were the clear signs of recent habitation, ash from fires that had been extinguished within decades, not centuries, tool marks on the stone that appeared fresh. Harrison's military instincts were screaming warnings. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a facility that had been actively used, possibly within living memory. The strategic positioning, the hidden entrance, the preservation of equipment, everything suggested a level of planning and purpose that went far beyond accidental discovery. The team followed a narrow passage that led deeper into the complex. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and reflected by the stone walls in ways that defied acoustics. Motion sensors triggered by their movement revealed that someone had installed modern detection equipment throughout the passages. The technology was decades old, but still functional, suggesting the complex had been monitored well into the latter half of the 20th century. 30 feet deeper, they encountered the first of several chambers that would challenge everything they thought they knew about Alaska's hidden history. The room was enormous, its ceiling disappearing into darkness beyond their light's reach. But it wasn't empty. Arranged throughout the space were workstations, equipment, and living quarters that spanned decades of occupation. Military cots from the 1940s sat alongside scientific instruments from the 1960s. Maps covered every wall, showing not just Alaska, but global geographical features marked with symbols and notations in multiple languages. Dr. Mitchell approached a work table covered in documents and immediately recognized Sergeant Chen's handwriting. But these weren't field notes from a 7-day mission. They were detailed journals spanning months, possibly years of observation and research. The entries described ongoing excavation of the complex, discoveries of additional chambers, and increasingly disturbing observations about the site's effects on human behavior. One entry, dated June 15, 1943, 4 months after the team's disappearance, read, "Torres completed mapping of the lower levels today. The geometric patterns extend much deeper than we initially calculated. Kim believes the entire mountain may be hollow, constructed rather than natural. The radio equipment functions perfectly down here, but every transmission we attempt is somehow redirected back to us. We're receiving our own messages, sometimes delayed by hours, sometimes by days. It's as if the mountain itself is listening." Harrison found himself reading over Mitchell's shoulder, his blood growing colder with each page. The implications were staggering. The Polar Star team hadn't died in the wilderness. They had survived, thrived even, continuing their mission in secret for months or possibly years after their official disappearance. But why hadn't they returned? Why had they chosen to remain hidden in this underground complex? The answer began to emerge as they explored additional chambers. The complex wasn't just a shelter or military installation. It was a research facility equipped with instruments and technology that seemed decades ahead of its time. Laboratories contained equipment that wouldn't be invented until the 1960s or later. Communication devices that appeared to function on principles that mainstream science hadn't discovered until the space age. In what appeared to be a central command center, banks of electronic equipment hummed with residual power despite having no visible connection to any electrical grid. Screens displayed maps and data that shifted and updated in real time, showing weather patterns, geological activity, and other information that should have been impossible to gather in 1943. But most disturbing were the personnel files stored in metal cabinets throughout the room. Dr. Mitchell opened file after file, each containing detailed psychological profiles of the 7 missing engineers. The documents tracked their behavior, their adaptation to underground living, and their gradual transformation from soldiers following orders to something else entirely. The clinical language couldn't disguise the underlying horror of what they described. Men who had volunteered for a simple reconnaissance mission had become subjects in some kind of long-term experiment. Staff Sergeant Torres's file contained photographs spanning several years, showing a man aging in isolation, his military bearing gradually giving way to something wild and desperate. Corporal Kim's psychological evaluations described increasing paranoia and obsessive behavior focused on the complex's communication systems. He had apparently spent years attempting to contact the outside world, only to discover that every message was being intercepted and redirected back into the complex. But it was Sergeant Chen's file that revealed the true scope of what had happened to the Polar Star team. The final entry, dated December 7, 1951, nearly 9 years after their disappearance, contained a handwritten note that chilled Harrison to the bone. Subject continues to demonstrate exceptional leadership qualities and adaptation to extended isolation. Recommend continuation of observation protocols. Subject's willingness to maintain operational security despite psychological stress indicates suitability for Phase 2 implementation. The note was signed with initials that Harrison didn't recognize, but the implications were clear. The 7 engineers hadn't stumbled upon this complex by accident. They had been led here, trapped here, and used as test subjects in some kind of classified experiment that had continued for years after their official deaths. As the team explored deeper into the complex, they found evidence of other occupants, personal belongings that didn't belong to the Polar Star team, uniforms from different military units, some dating to the 1950s and 1960s. Identity tags bearing names that Harrison would later discover belonged to other soldiers who had disappeared during classified missions in Alaska over the decades. The complex wasn't just the final resting place of 7 missing engineers. It was a collection point, a facility where military personnel had been brought, studied, and ultimately forgotten by the outside world. The official reports, the death certificates, the closed cases, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to hide the truth about what was happening in this remote corner of Alaska. Dr. Mitchell discovered a library containing thousands of documents, research notes, and experimental records spanning from 1943 to what appeared to be the early 1980s. The papers described psychological experiments, studies of human adaptation to extreme isolation, and research into the effects of prolonged exposure to the complex's unique electromagnetic environment. The subjects were identified only by numbers, but cross-referencing with the personnel files revealed the identities of dozens of missing military personnel. The research had been conducted by an organization that identified itself only as Project Deep Winter. The documents revealed a systematic program of human experimentation conducted under the cover of routine military operations. Soldiers were sent on classified missions to remote locations where they would encounter the complex and be trapped inside for observation and study. Harrison realized with growing horror that his own investigation might not be as independent as he had believed. The discovery of the buried equipment hadn't been accidental. Someone had known exactly where to dig, had guided the construction crew to the precise location where the cache had been hidden. The entire excavation might be part of a larger plan to finally expose the truth about Project Deep Winter and the dozens of soldiers who had disappeared into its underground laboratories. The complex's communication systems were still functional, connected to networks that extended far beyond the remote Alaskan wilderness. Monitoring equipment tracked not just the immediate area but military installations across the continent. Whoever had constructed this facility had created a surveillance network that could observe and potentially influence military operations across North America. As Harrison's team prepared to explore the deepest levels of the complex, they made one final discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a chamber that appeared to serve as living quarters, they found personal items that were still being used: fresh clothing, recently consumed food, and a logbook with entries dated just weeks before their arrival. The final entry, written in handwriting that matched samples from Sergeant Chen's 1943 field notes, contained a message that seemed directed specifically at their investigation team. "You weren't supposed to find us yet. The project isn't complete, but since you're here, you might as well know the truth. We never left because we couldn't leave, and now that you've found us, neither will you." The implications struck Harrison like a physical blow. The Polar Star team wasn't just still alive after 80 years in the complex. They were still there, somewhere in the deeper levels, waiting for the investigation team that they had somehow known would eventually arrive. The buried equipment hadn't been a cache left by dead soldiers. It had been bait, carefully placed to ensure that eventually someone would dig deep enough to uncover the entrance to their underground prison. As emergency alarms began sounding throughout the complex, Harrison realized that their arrival had triggered automated systems that were sealing the entrance passages. The same trap that had claimed 7 engineers in 1943 was closing around his team, and somewhere in the darkness of the deeper chambers, the original occupants were waiting to welcome their new companions to Project Deep Winter. The emergency klaxons echoed through the stone corridors like the wail of a dying animal. Harrison's radio crackled with static as he tried to reach the surface team, but every frequency returned nothing but white noise and fragments of transmissions that seemed to come from decades in the past. Dr. Mitchell grabbed his arm, her face pale in the artificial light. "The entrance shaft," she whispered. "It's sealing itself." They ran through passages that now felt like a maze, their footsteps creating echoes that seemed to multiply and distort with each turn. The geometric patterns carved into the walls appeared to pulse with their own inner light, casting shifting shadows that made navigation nearly impossible. When they reached the main chamber, their worst fears were confirmed. Massive stone blocks were sliding into place across the entrance shaft with mechanical precision, operated by some hidden system that had been waiting 8 decades to activate. The 2 military specialists with them, Sergeants Williams and Rodriguez, were already examining the sealing mechanism. "It's not random," Williams reported. "This is engineered. Someone designed this place to be a trap." The stone blocks fitted together with the same mathematical precision they had observed throughout the complex, creating a seal that would be impossible to breach from either side without heavy equipment. Harrison's training kicked in despite the growing panic. They needed to establish communication with the outside world and find an alternate exit before their air supply became critical. But as they explored the passages more thoroughly, it became clear that the complex had been designed with no emergency exits. Every corridor eventually led back to the central chambers or dead-ended at sealed passages that showed no signs of recent use. Dr. Mitchell made the discovery that changed everything. In a side chamber they had previously overlooked, she found a collection of personal journals that belonged to soldiers from different eras. The entries painted a picture of systematic entrapment spanning decades. Each group of military personnel had arrived believing they were conducting routine operations, only to find themselves prisoners in an underground facility that seemed to have its own agenda. A journal entry from Lieutenant Marcus Webb, dated 1967, described the gradual realization that their situation wasn't temporary. Day 43 in the complex. The others are starting to crack. Peterson keeps insisting that rescue teams are coming, but I've studied the sealing mechanism. This place was built to keep people in, not out. Whoever constructed this facility planned for long-term occupation from the beginning. Another entry from a Navy communications specialist named Sarah Chen, who had disappeared in 1974, revealed the true scope of the psychological manipulation. The complex responds to our presence. Rooms that were empty yesterday contain furniture today. Food appears in storage areas we've already searched. It's as if the facility is adapting to keep us comfortable enough to survive, but isolated enough to prevent escape. Harrison found himself thinking about the construction crew that had discovered the buried equipment. Had they been evacuated when the entrance sealed? Or were they now trapped on the surface, unable to explain what had happened to the investigation team? The communication blackout made it impossible to know if anyone outside even realized they were in danger. The deeper chambers revealed the full extent of Project Deep Winter's ambitions. Research laboratories contained documentation of experiments designed to study human behavior under extreme isolation. But these weren't crude tests. The facility had been equipped with sophisticated psychological monitoring equipment that tracked everything from stress hormones to sleep patterns. The subjects weren't just trapped. They were being studied with scientific precision. Dr. Mitchell discovered a central database that contained profiles of every person who had entered the complex since 1943. The files revealed that Project Deep Winter had been selecting specific types of individuals: military personnel with particular skill sets, scientists with specialized knowledge, and civilians with unique psychological profiles. Each group had been lured to the site under different pretenses, but the outcome was always the same. The database also contained disturbing information about the facility's true purpose. Project Deep Winter wasn't just an experiment in human isolation. It was a breeding ground for something larger, a testing facility where human subjects were being prepared for deployment in situations that the documentation only referred to as Phase 3 operations. The file suggested that some subjects, after years of conditioning, had been released back into the world to carry out unspecified missions. Sergeant Chen's name appeared in these Phase 3 files. According to the records, he had been successfully conditioned and deployed in 1952, 9 years after his initial disappearance. But the deployment records were incomplete, with no indication of what mission he had been assigned or whether he had ever completed it. The implications were staggering. How many missing military personnel had actually been released as programmed agents? As Harrison's team explored the research levels, they began experiencing the same psychological effects described in the historical journals. Time seemed to move differently in the complex. What felt like hours of exploration would register as minutes on their watches, or sometimes the reverse. Sleep became elusive, replaced by vivid dreams that seemed to blend with waking experiences. The story of the 7 Army engineers who vanished in 1943 was never just about men lost in the wilderness. It was about a decades-long conspiracy that used American soldiers as test subjects in one of the most classified programs in military history. Project Deep Winter proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you're fighting against, but the one giving you orders. The complex still lies beneath the Alaskan permafrost, its secrets buried with those who discovered them. And somewhere in the darkness, the original occupants continue their endless vigil, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to join their underground prison.